So as I've demonstrated already, just with just a very brief few infographics, California is being screwed by climate change. So how are we fighting back? Well, guess what? Even though California has really been bearing the brunt of climate change, we've also been leading the charge in fighting climate change. Some of what I've already talked about in this course really highlights that. But let's actually look at it from a policy side. So the vast bulk of what we have been dealing with actually comes down to California Assembly Bill 32, also known as the California Global Warming Solutions Act. It was signed into law in 2006 by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Arnold signed it. And the provisions of this bill were first and foremost to take some of the main provisions of the Kyoto Accord, which will actually be talked about in this week's discussion, and to actually set them as California policy, like meaning this is no longer some kind of thing that we're saying that we're going to do. No, we're going to do it. And one of the biggest things was we needed to get our greenhouse gas emission levels back down to 1990 levels by 2020. And we did it. Now, with that said, we have basically turned up the volume. We've basically turned up the effort. The goal now is to actually get our emissions to 40% below that by 2030, which I would argue is a very ambitious goal, but hey, shoot for the stars, you might end up on the moon. And who knows, maybe you'll make the stars too. And in fact, our goal is to even go more than that. By 2050, the goal is to be carbon neutral. And there's even talk about going carbon negative, meaning that our efforts to remove carbon dioxide here in California will offset our total emissions by 2050. Once again, that is a very ambitious goal. I will be really, really excited to see how we do with it. I'm not betting that we will be perfect with it, but I'm honestly very excited to see what happens. And just like with the lifestyle project that I had you all do, it starts with just doing a few things and then kind of ramping it up as time goes on. And that's really what we're doing here in California. We're ramping up our reduction efforts. So this law has gone so well, we've actually extended it to 2030 and then to 2050. And the policies and provisions of this law are developed and enforced by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. They issue a scoping plan roughly every 10 years with an update every 5 years. And basically what the scoping plan does is it basically says, here's the current situation in each of these different sectors. So industrial, transportation, infrastructure, electricity generation. And here's what we're going to do. Here's what needs to happen in each one of these. And then every 5 years, they kind of check in. Okay, here's how we're doing. Here's what we need to tweak. Here's what we need to beef up. Here's what's going great. Let's keep doing it. The cornerstone, the centerpiece of this program, though, is something called cap and trade, which I'll talk about in a few seconds. This law, as I mentioned, has actually been mostly successful. We achieved our 2020 goals. And in fact, in some areas, we are actually so well ahead of ourselves that we've even beefed up our goals for 2030, 2040, and 2050. So the provision of AB 32 was to get us to 1990 levels by 2020. As I mentioned, we did that. We have actually accomplished that. Now the goal is for us to go from 1990 levels down much further. Senate Bill 32, which was an extension of AB 32, basically mandates that we go down to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. So as I mentioned, there's also actually becoming carbon neutral or maybe even carbon negative. One thing I'll say really quickly, let me go back really quickly. The most ambitious part of this, though, is that in order for us to actually achieve this, our rate of decrease needs to actually become faster than it's been, which means we need to pick up our efforts. We need to do more. It's not just about doing what we're already doing. We actually need to continue doing more. That's the scary part of it, but it's also kind of the exciting part of it. So as I mentioned, the cornerstone of the whole program is this thing called a cap and trade program. So the way the cap and trade works is that the California Air Resources Board basically gives every single company, every single factory, every single manufacturer, every single electricity company an emissions allowance, basically saying that your business activities, whether it is building cars or producing electricity or anything like that, building boxes and everything in between, you get a certain level of emissions that you are allowed to do. You are given a certain, that is what is called the cap. You are given a certain allowance. You're allowed to emit this much carbon dioxide. The idea is that over time, these emissions allowances actually become lower and lower and lower. As companies get better at improving their carbon efficiency, becoming more efficient with their carbon emissions, they can actually do that. They can actually continue to decrease and decrease and decrease. That being said, there's actually a free market way of going about this. If you are a company that emits less than you are allowed to, that means that you have leftover excess allowances. You have allowances that you didn't need. On the other hand, there are other companies that may not be able to meet their allowances. They end up emitting more than they're allowed to. Well, what you can do as a company is you can say, okay, hey, we didn't emit this much. We will now sell these excess allowances to you. You give us money, we give you these excess allowances, and that allows you to then emit more. The idea behind this is it incentivizes using the free market. It incentivizes reducing your emissions. Why? Because if you reduce your emissions, that means you have leftover allowances. If you have leftover allowances, you can sell those and pocket the cash. So many companies have actually gone below their allowances. They've actually emitted less than they're allowed to. They sell the excess off to another company and they pocket the cash, and then that goes into their revenue. In many ways, what they actually do is they use the money to actually develop even more carbon efficient technology, which reduces their emissions even more, allowing them to make even more money. On the other hand, for other companies that are emitting too much, they now have to pay. They now have to buy more allowances. And so they buy more allowances, and then that means that they're losing money because of this. And one of the questions, so I've actually taken a whole course in California AB 32, and one of the questions I asked my instructor when talking about this is, what if a company just says, I'm not going to comply? Well, they can get slapped with all kinds of fines and all kinds of things that make their lives here in California a living hell. Basically, the way it works is that if you're going to do business in the state, you're going to abide by this policy. You are going to abide by this policy. Now, this may kind of sound far-fetched, but believe it or not, there is actually precedent for this working. In the East Coast of the United States, this has actually worked. Here's why. If you remember a few weeks ago when I talked about electricity generation, and I mentioned that coal is a big source of electricity generation. But I said that there was one big negative to it. That one big negative was acid rain. Coal has a lot of impurities in them, including sulfur. Sulfur oxidizes with oxygen to produce sulfur dioxide. That reacts with water vapor to produce sulfuric acid. That rains down as acid rain. If you lived on the east coast of the United States, acid rain was something that was actually threatening their forests, threatening their crops, harming their ecosystem, and harming their infrastructure because it was causing erosion of roads to happen a lot quicker. That means you have to spend more fixing those things. Well, in the mid 2000s, launched in the late 2000s, but in the mid 2000s, a handful of states in Northeast the United States actually came on board and said, you know what? We're going to make an agreement. We're going to do a cap and trade like policy on this. And so what we're going to do is every electricity generating company is only going to be able to use so much coal. And so that incentivizes them to then first off, this has actually resulted in about a 50%